Tonight, you're not simply falling asleep. You're stepping into the first gallery of a great exhibition of the human soul. Close your eyes and allow yourself to drift into a sleep where lines, shapes, and symbols speak in the language of humanity's oldest memory. Chapter 3. The Great Awakening. Greece, 7th to 5th centuries BCE. The earliest artistic styles emerged in the great Eastern despotisms, in vast oasis-like lands where the sun scorched the earth and only river-irrigated soil could sustain life. These styles remained almost unchanged for thousands of years. Quite different conditions existed in the neighboring coastal lands of the Eastern Mediterranean, on the large and small islands, along the jagged coastlines of Greece and Asia Minor. These regions were not ruled by a single sovereign. Instead, they became havens for piratical rulers and daring seafarers who crossed the seas in every direction. In their fortresses and port towns, great wealth accumulated, gained through trade and plunder. At first, the dominant power in this area was the island of Crete. Its rulers at times amassed such riches and influence that they sent embassies to Egypt. As we have seen, Cretan art made a noticeable impression on the Egyptians. The style of Cretan art eventually reached the Greek mainland, in particular Mycenae. It is difficult to say with certainty who originally inhabited the island. Recent discoveries suggest that the language spoken by the Cretans might have been an early form of Greek. Around 1000 BCE, warlike tribes poured in from Europe, seizing control of the mountainous Balkan Peninsula and the coastline of Asia Minor, driving out the previous inhabitants. Only fragments of that lost world remain, preserved in the epics of Homer, which tell us something of the splendor of the art destroyed during these long and violent wars. Among the newcomers were the Greek peoples. In the first centuries after their arrival, their art was austere and relatively primitive. It had none of the joyful vitality of the Cretan style. In fact, it often seems as if they wanted to surpass even the Egyptians in severity. Their pottery was decorated with simple geometric patterns, and when narrative scenes appeared, they followed strict, almost schematic forms. One such example, the Dipylon amphora, shows a funeral lamentation. The deceased lies on a bier, flanked by women raising their arms in ritual mourning, a typical custom of early tribal societies. This same quality of simplicity and clarity of structure marked Greek architecture, which first emerged in those distant centuries and, surprisingly, remains present even today in the towns and countryside of our modern world. The Parthenon is a temple of the Doric order, named after the Dorians, the tribe to which the Spartans belonged, known for their severity. Indeed, in buildings of this kind, there is nothing superfluous, nothing that doesn't serve a clear function. It's likely that the earliest temples of this type were built in wood, simple, walled sanctuaries, housing a statue of a god, surrounded by a ring of pillars that supported the roof. Around 600 BCE, the Greeks began to recreate these wooden forms in stone. Wooden pillars became stone columns, the wooden roof beams became heavy stone lintels. These stone beams were called architraves, and the whole upper structure resting on the columns became known as the entablature. One can still sense the wooden prototype where the projecting ends of the beams are carved into the stone. On these projections, 3 vertical grooves were usually cut, hence the name triglyph, which literally means 3 grooves in Greek. The spaces between the triglyphs are called metopes. These closely imitated features of earlier wooden construction are striking for their simplicity and harmonious proportions. Had the builders used plain square posts or cylindrical shafts, the temples would have appeared heavy and awkward. But instead they discovered a form, a column with a slight swelling in the middle and a gradual tapering toward the top. The result is a spring-like effect, as if the weight of the structure above gently presses down on the columns, which in turn push back and regain their shape. There is something almost lifelike in these columns, as if they were living beings gracefully bearing their burden. Although Greek temples are spacious and imposing, they never reach the colossal scale of Egyptian monuments. There is always a sense that these buildings were made by human hands and for human beings. The Greeks had no all-powerful ruler who could force a population into servile labor. Greek tribes lived in scattered city-states and port towns, often quarreling and competing with one another. But no single city ever succeeded in dominating all the others. Among these city-states, or polis, Athens, located in Attica, rose to remarkable prosperity. It was also Athens that played a crucial role in the artistic developments that followed. Here, one of the most extraordinary revolutions in the entire history of art reached its fullest expression. It is hard to say exactly when and where this transformation began. Perhaps around the time the first stone temples appeared in Greece, in the 6th century BCE. We know that up until this point, artists in the ancient East had been striving toward a very different kind of perfection. Their goal was to follow their predecessors as faithfully as possible, and to adhere strictly to the sacred artistic conventions in which they had been trained. When Greek artists began carving statues in stone, they started where the Egyptians and Assyrians had left off. The statues we have from this period show clearly that the Greeks learned from Egyptian models. Learning how to represent a standing human figure, indicating the joints of the body and shaping the muscular forms that surrounded them. But it's equally clear that Greek sculptors, while aware of these traditions, were not content to repeat formulas, no matter how effective. They began experimenting, taking creative risks. One might wonder, for example, how a knee actually looks. And while their first attempts may not have been entirely successful, the knees in these early Greek statues may in fact be less convincing than those of their Egyptian predecessors. The essential difference is this: the Greek sculptor chose to trust his eyes, rather than rely on inherited rules. From this point onward, the aim was no longer to master a fixed set of formulas for depicting the human form. Each sculptor began to ask himself how he, personally, ought to shape this particular figure. Egyptian art had been rooted in a codified system. Greek art placed its faith in vision. And once this revolution had begun, there was no stopping it. In their studios, sculptors developed new ideas, new ways of seeing and shaping the body. And each breakthrough was eagerly taken up by others, who in turn made their own discoveries. One artist found a new way to carve a torso. Another realized that a statue would seem more lifelike if the weight wasn't evenly balanced on both feet, if the figure looked as though it could move. Yet another noticed that a subtle curve to the lips could suggest the trace of a smile. To be sure, the Egyptian method was more reliable in many respects. The Greek experiments did not always succeed, but they opened a door, And what lay beyond was a new vision of art. Restless, searching, and alive, the smile often turned into a strained grimace, and what was meant to be a relaxed pose could slip into affectation. But these difficulties did not deter the Greeks. They had set out on a path from which there was no turning back. The painters followed in the sculptor's footsteps. We know very little about their works, apart from what is mentioned by ancient Greek writers. Yet it is important to remember that many Greek painters were, in their time, held in even higher esteem than sculptors. A glimpse of early Greek painting can be found in their painted pottery. These vessels, usually referred to as vases, though they were used more often for wine or oil than for flowers, became an entire industry in Athens. And the humble craftsmen working in their ergasteria, workshops, were no less driven by the desire to explore the new than any sculptor or poet. In earlier examples of vase painting from the 6th century BCE, one still senses the legacy of Egyptian convention. We see two Homeric heroes, Achilles and Ajax, playing a board game in their campaign tent. Both figures are shown strictly in profile, but their eyes are rendered frontally, an unmistakable Egyptian trait. Yet, in the way the bodies are drawn, in the placing of the arms and hands, the artist breaks with the older method. He was clearly attempting to show how two people actually look when seated face to face. He was no longer afraid to depict only the visible fingers of Achilles' left hand, partially hidden behind his shoulder. He no longer felt obliged to include in the drawing everything he knew to be there, but could not see. And once this old rule had been broken, once the artist began trusting his vision, a truly brilliant victory had been won. To the painters belongs one of the greatest discoveries in the history of art: the principle of foreshortening. Sometime shortly before 500 BCE, an astonishing event occurred. For the first time, artists dared to depict a human foot seen directly from the front. Judging from the monuments that have survived, this had never happened in all the long centuries of Egyptian or Assyrian art. One can feel the thrill of this breakthrough in a particular vase painting. It shows a young warrior donning his armor before battle. His parents flank him on either side, offering support in word and gesture, and their figures are still rendered entirely in profile. The youth's head, too, is shown in profile, and one can sense how difficult it was for the artist to attach it to a body seen from the front. His right foot is drawn in the familiar, safe profile, but the left, in a daring act, is shown frontally, with all 5 toes rendered as a row of small circles. Let no one accuse me of dwelling too long on such a small detail, for this minor element tells us something quite profound: that the old art had been left behind. It shows us that the artist had abandoned the requirement to render all parts of the body equally clearly, replacing it with the principle of a single, unified point of view. And he immediately clarified his intent. Next to the youth's foot, a shield leans against the wall. The vase painter does not draw it as a perfect circle, as it might appear in the mind's eye, but as it would actually be seen from the side. Yet both examples of vase painting remind us of something else. The lessons of Egyptian art had not simply been discarded. While adopting a consistent point of view, Greek artists still aimed to depict the human body with the utmost clarity and completeness. They held fast to clean contours and balanced compositions. They had no interest in capturing fleeting impressions or casual gestures. The old formulas, shaped by centuries of tradition, remained their point of departure. They simply no longer regarded those formulas as sacred or untouchable. The great transformations in Greek art, the discovery of naturalistic form and perspective, took place during one of the most astonishing periods in human history. It was then, in the Greek polis, that ancient traditions and myths about the gods began to be questioned. People emerged who, setting aside inherited beliefs, turned instead to the investigation of the nature of things. It was during this period that the world first came to know philosophy and science in the modern sense of the word. It was also then that theater emerged, born from ritual festivals held in honor of the god Dionysus. Yet one should not imagine that artists at the time were counted among the city's intellectuals. The wealthy citizens who ran the affairs of the polis and devoted their leisure hours to endless debates in the marketplace, and even the poets and philosophers, generally looked down upon sculptors and painters as men of a lower order. Artists worked with their hands and earned their livelihood through manual craft. And since they toiled in foundries, covered in dust and soot like any common laborer, they were not considered part of polite society. Even so, the social standing of artists in Greece was markedly higher than in Egypt or Assyria. The reason lies in the political structure of the Greek polis, particularly Athens, which were democratic states. These democracies made room, at least in principle, for modest working men to participate in governance, however much the wealthy elite might have scorned them. It was precisely during the flowering of Athenian democracy that Greek art reached its zenith. After repelling the Persian invasions, Athens, under the leadership of Pericles, set about rebuilding what had been destroyed. In 480 BCE, the temples of the Acropolis, the sacred hill of the Athenians, were burned and plundered by the Persians. Now, it was resolved that they would be rebuilt, this time in marble, and with a splendor never before seen. Pericles was no snob. Ancient writers tell us that he treated artists as equals. The architect to whom he entrusted the design of the temples was Ictinus. The sculptor responsible for the statues of the gods and for overseeing the adornment of the buildings was Phidias. None of the original works that earned Phidias his fame have survived. But it is important to try to imagine them, because we too easily forget what purposes Greek art served in that time. We know how passionately the biblical prophets denounced idolatry, yet we rarely associate their words with specific works of art. The Bible is filled with statements such as this one from Jeremiah 10:3-5. For the customs of the peoples are vanity. A tree from the forest is cut down and worked with an axe by the hands of a craftsman. They adorn it with silver and gold. They fasten it with hammer and nails so that it cannot move. Their idols are like scarecrows in a cucumber field, and they cannot speak. They must be carried, for they cannot walk. Do not be afraid of them, for they cannot do evil. Neither is it in them to do good. Jeremiah was referring to the idols of Mesopotamia, fashioned from wood and precious metals. But his words might just as easily have been directed at the creations of Phidias, produced only a few centuries later. As we walk through museum halls, among rows of white marble statues from classical antiquity, we do not always realize that among them are the very idols the Bible so vehemently condemned. People prayed before these images, offered sacrifices accompanied by incantations, and approached them with reverence and trembling, believing, or at least hoping, that these statues, these effigies, were in fact the gods themselves. The primary reason for the near-total disappearance of those celebrated antique statues is precisely that. When Christianity took hold, the faithful saw it as their duty to destroy the pagan idols. The sculptures now displayed in museums are, for the most part, later Roman copies, often of lesser quality, made to satisfy the demands of tourists, collectors, or for use as decoration in gardens and public baths. We ought to be grateful for these Roman copies, which at least offer a distant echo of the original masterpieces of Greek art. And yet, if we trust them blindly, without the assistance of imagination, they may do more harm than good. It was this kind of uncritical reception that gave rise to the widespread misconception that Greek art was cold, lifeless, and inert. That Greek statues had the same dull surface and vacant expressions as the plaster casts once used in old-fashioned art schools. Take, for example, the Roman copy of the Athena Parthenos, the monumental statue Phidias created for the Parthenon sanctuary. It hardly leaves a striking impression. To form an idea of what the original must have looked like, we must rely on ancient descriptions. The colossal figure, standing roughly 11 meters high, rose like a tree. Its wooden core was clad in precious materials. The goddess's armor and adornments were made of gold, while the exposed parts of her body were fashioned from ivory. This meant that the statue, especially its shield, garments, and inlaid eyes, shimmered with vivid flashes of color. The griffins on her golden helmet and the eyes of the serpent coiled behind the shield were almost certainly inlaid with gemstones. A person entering the temple and standing before this towering image of the goddess would have been struck with mystical awe. There was something primal in the idol, something bordering on the savage, something that seemed to echo the dark superstitions denounced by Jeremiah. And yet, at the same time, the ancient belief in demons inhabiting statues began to recede into the background. The Athena Parthenos, as conceived and executed by Phidias, was no longer a demon, nor even a mere idol. According to accounts from antiquity, she embodied a different understanding of the divine. Phidias's Athena was human in form and character. Her power lay not in magical force, but in the enchantment of beauty. Even then, it was becoming clear that Phidias's art had offered the Greek people a new vision of what it meant to be divine. Phidias's two greatest creations, the statue of Athena in the Parthenon and the statue of Zeus at Olympia, are irretrievably lost. But the temples that house them, along with some of the sculptural decoration, have partly survived. The temple at Olympia is one of the oldest. Construction began around 470 BCE and was completed by 457 BCE. On the metopes, square panels above the architrave, are depicted the labors of Heracles. One of them illustrates the myth in which Heracles is tasked with retrieving the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides. Whether he could not or simply did not want to complete the task himself, Heracles persuaded Atlas, the Titan who held up the sky, to fetch the apples for him. Atlas agreed, on the condition that Heracles would bear the heavens in his place, if only temporarily. The relief shows Atlas returning with the apples, while Heracles strains under the weight of the heavens. Athena, the clever helper of heroes, places a cushion on Heracles' shoulders. In her right hand, now missing, she once held a spear. The story is conveyed with remarkable simplicity and clarity. The sculptor preferred two basic poses, frontal and profile. Athena stands facing us directly, her head turned toward Heracles. It is not difficult to detect traces of Egyptian conventions in these figures. The grandeur, noble stillness, and strength of Greek sculpture owes something to these ancient canons. But by now, those rules had ceased to be constraints. The underlying scheme, which still governed the articulation of the body and clarified the relationship of its parts, had become a foundation from which the artist could study anatomy, the structure of bone and muscle. The confidence of hand gifted by this artistic heritage is precisely what gives each detail of the Parthenon frieze its clarity and truthfulness. This sense of rational calculation, of carefully measured placement of each figure, is a hallmark of all artistic achievements from this extraordinary era. Yet the ancient Greeks themselves held something else in even higher regard. The newly discovered freedom in depicting the human body, whether in stillness or in motion, opened the door to expressing inner life. A student of Socrates tells us that this was exactly what the great philosopher, who himself had trained as a sculptor, urged of artists. In his view, they should strive to depict mental exertion, studying closely how the emotions influence the behavior of the body. Let us recall that vase painters often followed in the footsteps of the great masters who pioneered new paths. One vessel shows a moving episode from the story of Odysseus. After 19 years of wandering, the hero returns home disguised as a beggar, leaning on a crutch, carrying a satchel and a cup. An old nurse, as she begins to wash his feet, recognizes him by the scar on his leg. The artist seems to have been following a version of the tale different from the Homeric text we know. On the vase, the nurse bears a different name, and the swineherd Eumaeus, absent in Homer's scene, is also depicted. Perhaps the painter had seen a theatrical performance of the episode. This was, after all, the very century in which Greek poets were shaping the art of drama. But to grasp the emotional power of the moment, there's no need for precise knowledge of the source. The looks exchanged between the nurse and the hero speak more eloquently than any words. Greek artists had mastered the art of conveying unspoken emotion, those subtle undercurrents that passed between people, and this ability to make visible the labors of the soul, carried out with the body held in quiet composure, is what transforms a simple gravestone into a great work of art. Hegeso, buried beneath stone, is portrayed just as she was in life. Her servant stands before her, holding a box of jewelry, from which the lady selects an ornament. This quiet scene recalls the image depicted on the throne of Tutankhamun. The same clarity of outline is present. Yet even though the Egyptian piece was created during a singularly refined moment in its tradition, it remains schematic, distant from nature. In the Greek relief, the old constraints of inherited formulas and fixed construction have been overcome. Gone is the rigid geometry. In its place come natural, supple forms. The mirrored gestures of the women's hands, enclosing the upper portion of the relief, the echoing curve of the chair, the gentle motion of the hand guiding the eye to the center of the composition, the flowing lines of the drapery contouring the body with such expressive fluidity. These all merge into a true harmony. revealed to the world for the first time through the art of 5th century Greece. You can close your eyes now. Picture the lion hunts of Mycenae, the golden tombs of Ur, the stone colonnades of Luxor. Picture the sculptor's hand, shaping kings from dust and memory. Time has passed, empires have fallen, but their shadows still dance on the walls of ancient palaces. Sleep well among gods, lions, and lost languages. Your sleep will be soft. And you, protected by ancient symbols, where everything is connected to everything.